Sarah Martinez wiped down the airplane seat for the 100th time that morning, her cloth moving in careful circles across the worn fabric. The early morning light filtered through the small airplane windows as she worked her way down the narrow aisle of the Boeing 737. Her cleaning cart squeaked slightly as she pushed it forward, loaded with supplies that had become as familiar to her as old friends. At 28, Sarah had been cleaning airplanes for 3 years now. It wasn't the job she had dreamed of as a little girl, but it paid the bills and gave her something that had become precious to her: routine and stability. After everything she had been through, those two things meant more than most people could understand. The other cleaning crew members were already gossiping as they worked. Sarah could hear their voices echoing through the cabin as they moved from row to row. She had learned early on to keep her head down and focus on her work. The airport was full of people who thought they knew everything about everyone based on what job they did or how they looked. "I don't know why they even bother hiring people like her," came a voice from somewhere behind her. Sarah recognized it immediately as belonging to Janet, a woman in her 50s who had made it clear from day one that she didn't think Sarah belonged there. "I mean, look at her. All those tattoos. What kind of professional has arms covered in ink like that?" Sarah's jaw tightened slightly, but she didn't turn around. Her long-sleeved uniform shirt covered most of her tattoos, but some still showed on her hands and wrists. She had heard comments like this countless times before. People saw the tattoos and made assumptions. They saw her job cleaning airplanes and made more assumptions. Very few people bothered to look deeper. "And she's always so quiet," added another voice. "Like she thinks she's better than the rest of us or something. Probably thinks this job is beneath her." If only they knew, Sarah thought as she carefully cleaned around the window. If only they understood that this job had quite literally saved her life. The truth was that Sarah Martinez had not always been an airplane cleaner. 3 years ago, she had been Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez of the United States Army, serving her second deployment in Afghanistan. She had been a combat medic, responsible for treating wounded soldiers under fire and getting them to safety. For 4 years, she had saved lives, patched up wounds, and carried injured men twice her size to helicopter landing zones while bullets flew around them. But nobody at the airport knew that. Nobody knew about the medals tucked away in a box in her small apartment. Nobody knew about the commendations for bravery, the Purple Heart she had earned when shrapnel from an IED had torn through her left shoulder, or the countless lives she had saved during her time in the military. Most importantly, nobody knew about the tattoos that covered her arms and back. They weren't random designs chosen from a tattoo parlor wall. Each one told a story. Each one honored a fallen comrade, memorialized a mission, or marked a life she had saved. The intricate designs that people dismissed as unprofessional were actually a living memorial to the brothers and sisters she had served with, some of whom had not made it home. Sarah finished cleaning the row and moved her cart forward. The familiar ache in her left shoulder reminded her of why she was here instead of still serving her country. The injury from that IED had ended her military career, but the invisible wounds had been what really drove her away from the life she had known. The nightmares had started during her recovery. The flashbacks came next. Then, the anxiety that made it hard to be in crowded places or around loud noises. The doctors had a name for it: post-traumatic stress disorder, but knowing what to call it didn't make it any easier to live with. When she had finally been discharged from the army, Sarah had found herself alone in a world that felt foreign and overwhelming. The structure and purpose that had defined her life for years was suddenly gone. The brotherhood she had known in the military seemed impossible to find in civilian life. She had tried a few different jobs, but the stress and unpredictability had triggered panic attacks that left her shaking and unable to work. That's when she had found the job at the airport. The work was simple and repetitive. The environment was structured and predictable. The early morning hours meant fewer people and less chaos. Most importantly, being around airplanes, even commercial ones, reminded her of the medical helicopters that had been such an important part of her military service. There was something comforting about the familiar smell of jet fuel and the sound of engines. The other cleaning crew members didn't understand any of this, of course. To them, she was just another worker who had somehow ended up in a job that didn't require much education or training. They saw someone who was different and decided that different meant less than. "Hey, Sarah." Janet's voice cut through her thoughts. "You missed a spot over here." Sarah looked over to see Janet pointing at a seat that looked perfectly clean to her. This was Janet's favorite game, finding fault with Sarah's work even when there wasn't any. Sarah walked over and cleaned the spot again, saying nothing. "You know," Janet continued, loud enough for the other workers to hear, "in my day, people took pride in their appearance at work. They didn't show up looking like they belonged in some biker gang." A few of the other cleaners chuckled. Sarah felt her face flush with embarrassment and anger, but she forced herself to stay calm. Getting into an argument wouldn't help anything. These people didn't know her story, and she had learned that trying to explain usually just made things worse. The morning wore on, and Sarah lost herself in the familiar rhythm of her work. Clean the seats, check the seat pockets, wipe down the tray tables, vacuum the floor. Move to the next row and repeat. The repetitive nature of it was actually soothing. It kept her mind occupied and gave her hands something to do. As she worked, Sarah found her thoughts drifting to her old life. She remembered the weight of her medical kit as she ran across the sand toward a wounded soldier. She remembered the feeling of satisfaction when she managed to stabilize someone long enough to get them to a field hospital. She remembered the bonds she had formed with the men and women she served with, bonds forged in combat and sealed with shared sacrifice. Those memories were both a comfort and a source of pain. She missed the sense of purpose she had felt as a medic. She missed knowing that her skills and training were making a real difference in the world. She missed being part of something bigger than herself. But she also remembered the last mission that had changed everything. The convoy that had hit the Th.ey. The chaos and confusion as she had tried to treat multiple casualties while under fire. The moment when the shrapnel had torn through her shoulder and she had realized she might not make it home herself. The long months of recovery and the growing realization that her military career was over. The sound of laughter brought her back to the present. A group of flight attendants was walking through the cabin, getting ready for the morning's first departure. They looked polished and professional in their crisp uniforms, their hair perfectly styled and their makeup flawless. "Excuse me," one of them said as she passed Sarah. The tone was polite but dismissive, the way someone might speak to a piece of furniture that needed to be moved. Sarah stepped aside and watched as the flight attendants continued down the aisle, chatting among themselves about their plans for their layover in Denver. Sarah couldn't help but notice the contrast between how people treated her and how they treated the flight attendants. Both were service jobs, both required dealing with the public, but one was seen as glamorous and the other as menial. The flight attendants were smiled at and thanked. Sarah was largely invisible unless someone needed to complain about something. As she gathered her cleaning supplies and prepared to move to the next airplane, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in one of the windows. She saw a young woman with tired eyes and careful posture, someone who had learned to make herself small and unnoticeable. It was a far cry from the confident soldier she had once been. The morning sun was getting higher now, and the airport was beginning to fill with passengers. Sarah could hear the distant sounds of announcements echoing through the terminals, the rumble of baggage carts, and the general bustle of people starting their journeys. Soon this airplane would be filled with travelers, each with their own stories and destinations. As Sarah pushed her cart toward the exit, she wondered what those passengers would think if they knew who had cleaned their airplane. Would they care that their seats had been prepared by someone who had once saved lives under enemy fire? Would it matter to them that the person they walked past without a second glance had earned medals for bravery in combat? Probably not, she realized. Most people were too caught up in their own lives to wonder about the stories of the service workers around them. And maybe that was okay. Maybe being invisible had its own kind of peace. But as she loaded her supplies onto the cart for the next airplane, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was meant for something more than this. The question was whether she would ever find the courage to pursue it, or whether the comfortable anonymity of her current life would keep her trapped forever. The other cleaning crew members were already heading to their next assignment, their earlier comments about Sarah apparently forgotten. They moved with the casual efficiency of people who had found their place in the world and were content with it. Sarah envied them that contentment, even as she knew she could never share it. She took one last look around the empty cabin before following them out. Tomorrow would bring another airplane, another opportunity to lose herself in the simple satisfaction of making something clean and ready for the next group of travelers. It wasn't the life she had planned, but it was the life she had now. As Sarah walked through the jet bridge toward the terminal, she had no idea that in just a few hours, everything would change. She had no way of knowing that her past was about to collide with her present in a way that would force her to confront the person she used to be and decide who she wanted to become. The morning felt like just another in a long series of identical days, but sometimes the most ordinary moments are actually the calm before an extraordinary storm. 3 hours later, Sarah found herself assigned to clean Flight 447, a delayed departure to Los Angeles that had been sitting at the gate longer than scheduled. The passengers had already boarded once, but a mechanical issue had forced everyone off while the maintenance crew worked on the problem. Now the airplane needed a quick cleaning before passengers could board again. Sarah was grateful for the assignment. The rush timeline meant she would be working alone, without Janet and the others around to make their usual comments. She could focus on her work in peace and maybe finish early enough to take her lunch break in the quiet employee break room where she liked to read. As she entered the cabin with her cleaning supplies, Sarah noticed that the airplane felt different somehow. The air was thick with tension and frustration from the earlier delay. Passengers had left behind newspapers, coffee cups, and the general detritus of people who had been forced to wait longer than expected. Some seats looked like they had barely been used, while others showed signs of passengers who had settled in for what they thought would be a long flight. Sarah began her routine, working methodically from front to back. She had developed a system over the years that was both efficient and thorough. Check the overhead bins for forgotten items, wipe down the tray tables and armrests, clean the windows, vacuum the floor. Each step followed naturally from the last, creating a rhythm that she found almost meditative. As she worked, Sarah's mind wandered to her plans for the evening. She had been thinking about visiting the VA hospital to volunteer in their rehabilitation program. Several of her fellow veterans had suggested it, saying that helping other injured soldiers might give her a sense of purpose again. But the idea of being around wounded veterans, of seeing fresh injuries and trauma, made her anxious. She wasn't sure she was ready to face those memories yet. The sound of footsteps in the jet bridge interrupted her thoughts. Sarah looked up to see a man in a pilot's uniform walking toward the airplane. He was tall and lean, probably in his 40s, with graying hair and the confident posture that seemed to come naturally to airline pilots. She had seen him before during her 3 years at the airport, though they had never spoken. Captain Michael Rodriguez had been flying for Delta Airlines for 15 years. He had started as a military pilot, flying transport missions in Iraq before transitioning to commercial aviation. Like many pilots with military backgrounds, he carried himself with a certain bearing that spoke of discipline and responsibility. Sarah nodded politely as he entered the cabin, then returned to her work. She was used to flight crews walking through during cleaning operations. Most of them barely acknowledged her presence, treating her as part of the airplane's equipment rather than as a person. But Captain Rodriguez surprised her by stopping. "How's it going?" he asked, his voice carrying a slight Texas accent. "I heard we had quite a mess in here after the delay." Sarah looked up, startled by the friendly tone. Most pilots, when they spoke to her at all, used the same polite but distant voice they might use with any service worker. This man sounded genuinely interested in her answer. "It's not too bad," Sarah replied, her voice quiet from hours of working alone. People were frustrated, but they didn't make too much of a mess. "Should have it ready in about 20 minutes. Captain Rodriguez nodded and began his own pre-flight inspection, checking overhead bins and looking for anything that might have been left behind by maintenance crews. As he worked, he glanced occasionally at Sarah, something nagging at the back of his mind. There was something familiar about her movements, he realized. The way she carried herself despite being bent over cleaning seats. The careful, efficient way she worked. It reminded him of something from his military days, though he couldn't quite place what. Sarah was wiping down a tray table when she felt the pilot's eyes on her. She looked up and caught him staring at her hands. More specifically, he was staring at her wrists, where the edge of a tattoo was visible despite her long sleeves. Captain Rodriguez felt his breath catch in his throat. There, just visible on the woman's left wrist, was a small part of what looked like military insignia. He had seen enough military tattoos during his time in the Air Force to recognize the distinctive style and design elements. "Excuse me," he said, his voice suddenly serious. "I don't mean to be personal, but is that a military tattoo?" Sarah's hands froze on the tray table. She felt her heart rate spike, the familiar anxiety rising in her chest. This was exactly the kind of attention she had been trying to avoid. She considered lying, making up some story about getting the tattoo because she thought it looked cool. But something in the pilot's voice stopped her. "Yes," she said quietly, not looking up from her work. Captain Rodriguez moved closer, his pilot's inspection forgotten. "What branch?" "Army," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She could feel her shoulders tensing, preparing for the inevitable questions that would follow. "How long did you serve?" 4 years. 2 deployments to Afghanistan." The words came out automatically, like responses she had given to VA doctors and government forms. Captain Rodriguez felt a wave of recognition and respect wash over him. He had spent enough time around military personnel to recognize the signs. The woman's posture, her efficient movements, her quiet competence, it all made sense now. "What was your MOS?" he asked, using the military term for job specialty. Sarah finally looked up at him, surprised that he knew the terminology. 68W, Combat Medic. The moment the words left her mouth, Captain Rodriguez's expression changed completely. His eyes widened and he took a step back, staring at her with something that looked like shock. "Wait," he said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Sarah Martinez?" Sarah's blood ran cold. Nobody at the airport knew her full name except for Human Resources. The name on her uniform shirt just said Sarah. How could this pilot possibly know who she was? "I'm sorry," she said, though her voice betrayed her nervousness. Captain Rodriguez was staring at her intently now, his mind racing through memories from years ago. "Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez. 10th Mountain Division. You were stationed at FOB Shank in 2021. Sarah felt the world tilt around her. Her hands began to shake, and she had to grip the back of the airplane seat to steady herself. Who are you?" "Captain Michael Rodriguez, but back then, I was First Lieutenant Rodriguez. I flew transport missions for the Air Force. We worked together on several medical evacuations." His voice was filled with amazement and something else, something that sounded like awe. The memories came flooding back to Sarah all at once. The hot Afghan sun beating down on the landing zone. The sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the air. The urgency of getting wounded soldiers loaded and ready for transport to field hospitals. And, yes, she remembered him now. The young Air Force pilot who had flown some of those critical missions. "Lieutenant Rodriguez," she whispered, the memories making her feel dizzy. "You flew the bird that took out Sergeant Thompson after the IED incident on Route Falcon." "That's right," Captain Rodriguez said, his voice soft with memory. "And you're the medic who kept him alive during that flight. You worked on him for 45 minutes while we flew through a sandstorm, never stopping, never giving up." Sarah closed her eyes, remembering that day with painful clarity. Sergeant Thompson had been barely clinging to life when they loaded him into the helicopter. He had lost massive amounts of blood and was going into shock. The flight to the field hospital had been rough, with heavy turbulence from the storm, but she had managed to stabilize him enough to give him a fighting chance. "He made it home," Captain Rodriguez continued. "Thompson made it home to his wife and kids because of you." "Do you know that?" Sarah opened her eyes, surprised. I never found out what happened to him after we handed him over to the medical team. He recovered completely. I kept in touch with him for a while. He went back to his family in Ohio and became a mechanic. Has 3 kids now. He talks about you sometimes, about the medic who saved his life. The airplane cabin suddenly felt too small, too confining. Sarah could feel panic beginning to rise in her chest. The memories were coming too fast, bringing with them all the emotions and trauma she had been trying to bury. "I need to get back to work," she said, turning away and picking up her cleaning cloth with hands that were visibly shaking now. But Captain Rodriguez wasn't finished. "Wait, please. I have to ask you something. What are you doing here? I mean, cleaning airplanes? You were one of the best medics I ever worked with. You saved lives, earned commendations. What happened?" Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. This was exactly what she had been afraid of, someone from her past finding her here, in this life that felt so small compared to what she used to be. "Things change," she said, her voice tight with the effort of holding back emotion. "People change. But, you were a hero," Captain Rodriguez insisted. "You saved so many people. I saw you work miracles out there. You were fearless." The word fearless hit Sarah like a physical blow. If only he knew how afraid she was now. How the sound of helicopters could still send her into a panic attack. How crowded places made her break into a cold sweat. How she had nightmares about the soldiers she couldn't save, the ones who had died in her arms despite everything she had tried to do. "I wasn't fearless," she whispered. "I was just doing my job." "Your job?" Captain Rodriguez shook his head in disbelief. "Your job was to treat wounded soldiers in combat zones while people were shooting at you. Your job was to make life and death decisions under pressure that would break most people. You carried men twice your size to safety while under enemy fire." Sarah could feel herself beginning to hyperventilate. The airplane cabin felt like it was closing in around her. The familiar symptoms of a panic attack were beginning: rapid heartbeat, sweating palms, the feeling that she couldn't get enough air. "I have to go," she said, abandoning her cleaning supplies and heading for the exit. "Sarah, wait." Captain Rodriguez called after her. "Please, just talk to me for a minute." But Sarah was already walking quickly down the jet bridge, her breathing becoming more labored with each step. She needed to get somewhere quiet, somewhere safe, where she could calm down and get control of herself again. Captain Rodriguez stood alone in the airplane cabin, surrounded by the cleaning supplies Sarah had left behind. He stared at the spot where she had been standing, his mind reeling from the encounter. He remembered her so clearly now. Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez had been legendary among the medical personnel at FOB Shank. She had been calm under fire, decisive in crisis situations, and absolutely devoted to saving every soldier she could. He had personally flown at least a dozen medical evacuations where she had been the primary medic, and every single one of those soldiers had made it to the field hospital alive because of her skills and determination. The idea that someone with her background and abilities was now cleaning airplanes seemed impossible to believe. Something had happened to her, something that had driven her away from the medical field and into this anonymous job where she could hide from the world. Captain Rodriguez looked down at the cleaning cloth she had dropped. Without really thinking about it, he picked it up and finished cleaning the tray table she had been working on. It was the least he could do for someone who had done so much for others. As he worked, he found himself thinking about the other veterans he had known who had struggled to transition back to civilian life. The military gave people a sense of purpose, a brotherhood, a mission that was bigger than themselves. When that was taken away, some people found it hard to figure out where they belonged in the regular world. But Sarah Martinez wasn't just any veteran. She had been exceptional, a natural healer with instincts that couldn't be taught. The fact that she was wasting those talents cleaning airplanes felt like a tragedy. Captain Rodriguez finished the cleaning and gathered up Sarah's supplies. He would make sure they got back to her supervisor, along with an explanation that the cleaning had been completed. But, more importantly, he was going to find Sarah Martinez and convince her that she was meant for something more than hiding behind an anonymous uniform. He had no idea how difficult that conversation was going to be, or how much pain Sarah would have to confront before she could even consider stepping back into the world where her skills could make a difference again. All he knew was that heroes like Sarah Martinez were too rare to let disappear into the shadows without a fight. Sarah didn't stop running until she reached the employee break room in the basement of the terminal building. Her chest was tight and her hands were shaking as she fumbled with her employee ID card to get through the security door. The break room was mercifully empty. Most of the cleaning staff was still working their morning shifts on the upper levels. She collapsed into one of the plastic chairs around a small table and put her head in her hands, trying to control her breathing. The panic attack was in full swing now, her heart racing so fast she wondered if she might pass out. The fluorescent lights seemed too bright, the hum of the vending machines too loud. This was exactly what she had been afraid of for 3 years. Someone from her past life finding her here, seeing what she had become, asking questions she didn't want to answer. The careful walls she had built around her new identity were crumbling, and she felt exposed and vulnerable in a way that reminded her of the worst days after her discharge from the army. 20 minutes passed before Sarah felt calm enough to think clearly. She knew she needed to get back to work before someone noticed she was missing, but the thought of facing Captain Rodriguez again made her stomach turn. What if he told other people who she used to be? What if word got back to her supervisors? What if the other cleaning staff found out and started asking questions? The employee break room door opened, and Sarah looked up to see Linda Chen, one of the few co-workers who had ever been genuinely kind to her. Linda was in her 60s, a grandmother who had been working at the airport for over a decade in various service roles. She had always treated Sarah with quiet respect, never prying into her background but offering small kindnesses when Sarah seemed particularly struggling. "Sarah, honey," Linda said, her voice filled with concern. "Are you okay? One of the pilots came looking for you about 20 minutes ago. Said he had your cleaning supplies." Sarah felt her anxiety spike again. "What did you tell him?" "I told him you were on your break and I'd make sure you got them back. But he seemed really worried about you. Said it was important that he talked to you." Linda sat down in the chair across from Sarah, studying her face with the experienced eye of someone who had raised 4 children and dealt with countless crises. "What's going on, sweetheart?" For a moment, Sarah considered telling Linda everything. The older woman had always been a good listener, and Sarah desperately needed someone to talk to. But the habit of keeping her past secret was too strong. "It's nothing," Sarah said. "Just a misunderstanding." Linda didn't look convinced, but she didn't push. "Well, if you need to talk about anything, you know where to find me. And don't worry about the pilot, I told him you'd catch up with him later if it was important." After Linda left, Sarah sat alone with her thoughts. She knew she couldn't hide forever. Captain Rodriguez had clearly recognized her, and he didn't seem like the type of person who would just let this go. She was going to have to face him eventually and try to convince him to keep her secret. But first, she needed to understand why this encounter had affected her so deeply. It wasn't just the surprise of being recognized, it was everything that recognition represented. For 3 years, she had been successfully hiding from the person she used to be. Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez was a hero, someone who had saved lives and earned the respect of everyone she served with. Sarah the airplane cleaner was invisible, anonymous, safe. The problem was that being recognized as her former self forced her to confront the question she had been avoiding: why had she given up on that person? Why had she chosen to hide instead of finding a way to use her skills and experience in civilian life? The answer was complicated and painful. After her medical discharge, Sarah had tried to work in civilian hospitals. She had the training and experience to be an excellent emergency room nurse or paramedic. But the high-stress environment, the life and death decisions, the constant pressure, it all brought back memories of Afghanistan that she wasn't ready to handle. The first time she had been treating a trauma patient and the helicopter landing pad alarms had gone off, she had frozen completely. The sound had transported her back to the desert, to the chaos of combat medicine where every decision could mean the difference between a soldier going home or being shipped back in a flag-draped coffin. She had tried therapy, medication, support groups for veterans with PTSD. Some of it helped, but the core problem remained. The skills that had made her an exceptional combat medic were inseparable from the trauma that had ended her military career. Every time she tried to use those skills, she was forced to relive the worst experiences of her life. So she had chosen safety over purpose, anonymity over recognition, simple routine over meaningful challenge. It had seemed like the only way to survive, but now she was beginning to wonder if she had been merely existing instead of living. Sarah was pulled from her thoughts by the sound of her phone buzzing. She had a text message from her supervisor asking where she was and whether she needed backup on the delayed flight. Sarah realized she had been sitting in the break room for over an hour. She gathered her courage and headed back upstairs, hoping that Captain Rodriguez would be long gone by now. But as she approached the gate for Flight 447, she could see him standing near the jet bridge, obviously waiting for her. "Sarah," he said as soon as he saw her. His voice was gentler now, less urgent than it had been during their encounter in the airplane. "I'm glad you came back. I was worried about you." "I'm fine," Sarah said automatically, though they both knew it wasn't true. "I just needed some air." Captain Rodriguez looked at her carefully, taking in her pale complexion and the way she kept glancing around as if looking for escape routes. He had seen this before in other veterans, the hypervigilance, the carefully controlled anxiety, the way trauma could turn confident soldiers into people who jumped at shadows. "Look," he said, "I know I caught you off guard back there. I'm sorry about that. I should have been more thoughtful about how I approached this." Sarah was surprised by the apology. She had expected him to be pushy, to demand answers or lecture her about wasting her potential. Instead, he seemed genuinely concerned about her well-being. "I brought your cleaning supplies," he continued, gesturing to her cart which was parked nearby. "I finished cleaning the airplane. Figured it was the least I could do." This surprised Sarah even more. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did." Captain Rodriguez's voice was firm. "You've done more for people than most of us will do in a lifetime. One airplane cleaning is nothing compared to that." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, the busy airport moving around them. Sarah could see some of her co-workers in the distance, probably wondering why she was talking to a pilot for so long. "Can I ask you something?" Captain Rodriguez said finally. "And you don't have to answer if you don't want to." "But what happened? I mean, I understand if you don't want to talk about the military stuff, but you had so much potential. You could be saving lives right now instead of." He gestured helplessly at the cleaning cart. Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest, but this time it wasn't quite panic. It was something closer to sadness, grief for the person she used to be and the life she had given up. "I tried," she said quietly. "After I got out, I tried to work in hospitals. But every time there was an emergency, every time I heard helicopter rotors or ambulance sirens, I would freeze up. I couldn't function when it mattered most." Captain Rodriguez nodded slowly. "PTSD?" "Among other things." Sarah looked down at her hands, at the tattoos that were visible on her wrists. "I kept having flashbacks to the soldiers I couldn't save. The ones who died in my arms. Every time I tried to treat a patient, I would see their faces instead." "How many did you lose?" Captain Rodriguez asked gently. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. This was the question she had been avoiding for 3 years, the one that cut to the heart of why she had given up on medicine. 17, she whispered finally. 17 soldiers died under my care during my 2 deployments. I know the exact number because I dream about every single one of them." Captain Rodriguez felt his heart break a little. He had flown medical evacuations for 2 years in Afghanistan, and he knew the statistics. Combat medics had one of the highest rates of PTSD among military personnel, precisely because they were responsible for making life-and-death decisions in impossible situations. "Sarah," he said, his voice filled with compassion, "you know that's not how it works, right? You didn't lose those 17 soldiers. You fought for them. You gave them every chance they had." "But it wasn't enough," Sarah said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I was supposed to save them, and I failed." "No." Captain Rodriguez's voice was firm now. "That's not failure. That's war. People die in war, and it's not the medic's fault when they can't work miracles." Sarah shook her head. "You don't understand. These were good people. They had families, dreams, futures ahead of them. And I couldn't keep them alive long enough to get home." Captain Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to respond. He had known other veterans who carried this kind of survivor's guilt, who blamed themselves for deaths that were far beyond their control. "How many did you save?" he asked finally. Sarah looked up at him, confused. "What? How many soldiers did you save? How many people made it home because of your skills and training and determination?" Sarah had never really thought about it that way. She had been so focused on the failures, on the deaths she couldn't prevent, that she had never tried to count the successes. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I do," Captain Rodriguez said. "I flew medical evacuations for 2 years, and I worked with a lot of medics. The average combat medic saves about 30 to 40 lives during a deployment. The exceptional ones, the ones like you, save twice that many. You had 2 deployments, which means you probably saved somewhere between 150 and 200 people." Sarah stared at him, trying to process this information. She had never thought about her service in terms of lives saved versus lives lost. In her mind, the 17 deaths had overshadowed everything else. "That's 150 families who got their sons and daughters back," Captain Rodriguez continued. 150 people who got to come home, get married, have children, live full lives because you kept them alive when it mattered most. For the first time in years, Sarah felt something other than shame when she thought about her military service. It wasn't forgiveness, she wasn't ready for that yet, but it was the beginning of a different perspective. "But the nightmares," she said. "The flashbacks. I can't function as a medic when I might freeze up during an emergency." Captain Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "Have you ever considered that there might be other ways to use your skills? Ways that don't involve trauma medicine but still make a difference?" Sarah looked at him questioningly. "There are a lot of veterans coming home with physical and psychological injuries," he said. "People who need help transitioning back to civilian life. People who might benefit from talking to someone who understands what they've been through." "You mean like counseling?" "Maybe. Or maybe something more hands-on. Physical therapy, occupational therapy, helping veterans learn to cope with disabilities. There are programs that specifically look for veterans to help other veterans." Sarah felt a small spark of interest, quickly followed by familiar anxiety. "I don't know if I'm ready for something like that." "You don't have to decide right now," Captain Rodriguez said. "But I want you to think about something. You've spent the last 3 years hiding from who you used to be, trying to make yourself invisible. But what if instead of hiding your past, you found a way to use it to help other people who are struggling with the same things you've been dealing with?" Before Sarah could respond, her supervisor appeared around the corner, looking irritated. "Martinez," he called out. "Where have you been? You've got 3 more aircraft to clean before the end of your shift." Sarah felt herself shrinking back into her invisible persona, the brief moment of possibility fading back into familiar anxiety. "I have to go," she said to Captain Rodriguez. "Wait," he said, pulling a business card from his wallet and writing something on the back. "This is my contact information. And, on the back, I've written the name and number of someone I think you should meet. She's a veteran who runs a program helping other veterans transition back to civilian life. Just think about calling her, okay?" Sarah took the card without looking at it and hurried away, following her supervisor toward the next airplane that needed cleaning. But, as she walked, she could feel the card in her pocket like a small weight, a tangible reminder that maybe, just maybe, there was another path forward. Captain Rodriguez watched her go, hoping he had planted a seed that might eventually grow into something more. He had seen too many good people waste their potential because they were afraid to face their past. Sarah Martinez was too valuable, too skilled, and too needed to disappear into anonymity. As he prepared for his own departure to Los Angeles, Captain Rodriguez made a mental note to check in on Sarah's progress in a few weeks. He had a feeling that this conversation was just the beginning of a much longer journey for both of them. 2 weeks passed before Sarah found the courage to look at the business card Captain Rodriguez had given her. She had kept it in her pocket, moving it from one uniform to another each day, but she hadn't been able to bring herself to read what he had written on the back. The encounter had changed something fundamental in how she saw her work at the airport. Where before she had found comfort in the routine and anonymity, now she felt increasingly restless. The simple tasks that had once been soothing now felt empty and meaningless. She found herself watching the pilots and flight attendants with new eyes, wondering what their stories were and how they had found their paths to meaningful work. Janet and the other cleaning staff had noticed the change in her demeanor, though they interpreted it differently than Sarah intended. "Look at Miss High and Mighty over there," Janet said one morning as they prepared their equipment for the day's assignments. "Ever since that pilot was talking to her a couple weeks ago, she's been acting like she's too good for this job." Sarah ignored the comment, as she had learned to do over the years, but it stung more than usual. She wasn't acting superior, she was simply questioning whether hiding from her past was really the best way to heal from it. That evening, Sarah sat in her small apartment with Captain Rodriguez's business card on the kitchen table in front of her. She had finally worked up the courage to read the name and phone number he had written on the back: Dr. Maria Vasquez, Veterans Transition Services. Below that, he had written a short note: "She helped me when I was struggling to find my place after the military. Give her a chance." Sarah stared at the card for a long time, thinking about everything Captain Rodriguez had said. The idea that she had saved hundreds of lives instead of focusing on the 17 she had lost was still difficult to accept, but it had given her a new framework for thinking about her service. She thought about Sergeant Thompson, the soldier Captain Rodriguez had mentioned. According to the pilot, Thompson had gone home to his family, recovered completely, and was now raising 3 children. Sarah had played a critical role in making that possible, but she had never known the outcome. How many other soldiers had she saved whose story she had never heard? Finally, with hands that trembled only slightly, Sarah picked up her phone and dialed Dr. Vasquez's number. "Veterans Transition Services, this is Maria," came a warm voice with a slight accent. "Hi," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Sarah Martinez. Captain Michael Rodriguez gave me your number. He said you might be able to help me." There was a pause, and Sarah wondered if she should hang up. "Of course," Dr. Vasquez said finally. "Michael mentioned he had met someone who might benefit from our services. Why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself?" Over the next 30 minutes, Sarah found herself telling Dr. Vasquez things she had never told anyone. About her military service, her medical discharge, her struggles with PTSD, and her current job cleaning airplanes. Dr. Vasquez listened without judgment, asking gentle questions and offering understanding comments. "Sarah," Dr. Vasquez said when Sarah had finished her story, "what you're describing is incredibly common among combat veterans, especially medics. The transition from a high-stakes, meaningful career to civilian life can be one of the most challenging things a person can face." "But I had skills," Sarah said. "I should have been able to find something meaningful to do with my medical training." "Skills aren't the issue," Dr. Vasquez replied. "Trauma doesn't care how skilled or capable you are. It affects everyone differently, and there's no shame in needing time to heal before you're ready to use those skills again." Dr. Vasquez explained that her program worked with veterans to identify their strengths, address their challenges, and find pathways to meaningful civilian careers. Some veterans went back to school, others started their own businesses, and many found ways to serve their communities using the skills they had developed in the military. "I'd like you to come in for a consultation," Dr. Vasquez said. "No commitment, no pressure. Just a chance to talk face-to-face and see if our program might be a good fit for you." Sarah agreed to meet with Dr. Vasquez the following week, and, for the first time in years, she felt a small spark of hope about her future. The consultation took place in a small office building near the Th.ey hospital. Dr. Vasquez was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and an air of calm competence that reminded Sarah of the best officers she had served under in the Army. The office was decorated with photos of veterans who had successfully transitioned to civilian careers, and Sarah found herself studying their faces, wondering if she could ever look that confident and purposeful again. "Tell me about your time as a combat medic," Dr. Vasquez said after they had settled in her office. "Not the difficult parts, we'll get to those later if you want to. Tell me about what you loved about the job." Sarah was surprised by the question. No one had ever asked her what she had loved about being a medic. "I loved the challenge," she said slowly. "Every situation was different, and I had to think quickly and adapt to changing circumstances. I loved working as part of a team where everyone depended on each other. And I loved knowing that what I did mattered. That my skills and training could literally mean the difference between life and death." "Do you miss those aspects of your work?" Sarah nodded, feeling tears forming in her eyes. "Every day. I know cleaning airplanes is honest work, and there's nothing wrong with it. But it doesn't feed my soul the way medicine did." Dr. Vasquez leaned forward in her chair. What if I told you there were ways to recapture some of those feelings without putting yourself in the high-stress trauma situations that trigger your PTSD? How? There are many different paths in healthcare and veteran services that might appeal to someone with your background. You could work in preventive care, helping people stay healthy instead of treating them after they're injured. You could work in rehabilitation, helping people recover from injuries or surgeries. You could train other medics or EMTs, passing on your skills to a new generation. Dr. Vasquez paused, studying Sarah's face. Or, she continued, you could work specifically with veterans who are struggling with the transition to civilian life. People who understand exactly what you've been through and who could benefit from your experience and expertise. Sarah felt her heart racing, but this time it wasn't from anxiety. It was excitement, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. What would that look like, she asked. Dr. Vasquez smiled. It could look like a lot of different things. We have veterans who work as counselors, helping other veterans deal with PTSD and substance abuse. We have veterans who work as job coaches, helping their peers find meaningful employment. We have veterans who work in physical therapy and occupational therapy, helping disabled veterans learn to adapt to their injuries. And, you think I could do something like that? Sarah, you spent 4 years making life and death decisions under extreme pressure. You saved hundreds of lives in some of the most challenging conditions imaginable. You've overcome your own struggles with PTSD and built a stable, if not entirely satisfying, life for yourself. Those experiences don't make you damaged, they make you uniquely qualified to help other people who are facing similar challenges. Over the following weeks, Sarah began attending Dr. Vasquez's support group for veterans in transition. She was nervous at first, worried that sharing her story would make her feel exposed and vulnerable. But she quickly discovered that there was something powerful about being around other people who understood exactly what she had been through. There was Marcus, a former infantry sergeant who had struggled with alcohol abuse after leaving the army. There was Jennifer, a former Air Force mechanic who had been sexually assaulted by a superior officer and was working to rebuild her sense of trust and safety. There was David, a former Marine who had lost his leg to an IED and was learning to navigate civilian employment with a disability. Each of them had stories of trauma and struggle, but they also had stories of resilience and recovery. Sarah began to see that her own journey from combat medic to airplane cleaner to someone seeking a new path was not unusual or shameful. It was part of a larger narrative of people who had served their country and were now working to find their place in the civilian world. As Sarah became more comfortable in the group, she began sharing her own experiences more openly. She talked about the nightmares and flashbacks that had driven her away from medicine. She talked about the shame she felt about wasting her skills and training. She talked about the loneliness of feeling like she had to hide her true identity from her coworkers and supervisors. But she also began talking about the positive aspects of her military service. She shared stories about successful medical evacuations, about soldiers she had saved, about the sense of purpose and camaraderie she had felt as part of a medical team. For the first time in years, she was able to remember her service with pride instead of pain. Dr. Vasquez began working with Sarah on developing a plan for her future. They explored different options for using her medical training in lower stress environments. They talked about the possibility of going back to school to become a physician's assistant or a nurse practitioner. They discussed opportunities to work with veteran service organizations or in VA hospitals. But the option that most appealed to Sarah was the possibility of becoming a peer counselor for other veterans with PTSD. The idea of using her own struggles to help other people navigate similar challenges felt like a way to transform her pain into something useful. I think I want to try it, Sarah told Dr. Vasquez after several weeks of preparation and training. I want to see if I can help other veterans the way you've helped me. Dr. Vasquez smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. I have an opportunity one think you'd be perfect for. She explained that the VA hospital was looking for peer counselors to work with newly returned veterans who were struggling with the transition to civilian life. The position would involve one-on-one counseling, group sessions, and advocacy work to help veterans access the services and benefits they needed. It won't be easy, Dr. Vasquez warned. You'll be working with people who are dealing with some of the same issues you faced. That can be triggering sometimes. But it can also be incredibly healing to find meaning in your own struggles by using them to help others. Sarah felt nervous but excited about the opportunity. For the first time in years, she was contemplating a future that involved more than just getting through each day. She was thinking about a life where her experiences and skills could make a real difference. The process of transitioning from airport cleaning staff to peer counselor took several months. Sarah had to complete additional training, undergo a background check, and gradually reduce her hours at the airport while she prepared for her new role. During this transition period, she encountered Captain Rodriguez again. He was passing through the airport between flights when he saw her in the terminal, dressed in civilian clothes and carrying a folder of training materials from the Th.ey. "Sarah," he called out, jogging over to where she was sitting. "How are you doing? You look different." Sarah smiled, realizing that she probably did look different. She felt more confident, more purposeful than she had in years. "I'm good," she said. "Really good. I wanted to thank you for giving me Dr. Vasquez's number. She's helped me find a new direction." Captain Rodriguez sat down beside her, his face lighting up with curiosity and pleasure. "Tell me about it." Sarah explained about the peer counseling program, about the training she had been completing, and about her plans to start working with veterans who were struggling with PTSD and other transition issues. "That's incredible," Captain Rodriguez said when she had finished. "You're going to be amazing at that. You have so much to offer people who are going through what you've experienced." "I hope so," Sarah said. "I'm nervous, but, for the first time in years, I'm excited about the future instead of just trying to survive each day." They talked for a few more minutes before Captain Rodriguez had to catch his flight. As he prepared to leave, he turned back to Sarah. "Can I ask you something? Do you ever think about those people at the airport who made comments about your tattoos and your job?" Sarah nodded. "Sometimes. What do you think they'd say if they knew who you really are and what you're about to do?" Sarah thought about Janet and the other cleaning staff who had dismissed her as someone who didn't belong, who had judged her based on her appearance and her job title without knowing anything about her background or her potential. "I think they'd be surprised," she said finally. "I think they'd be ashamed," Captain Rodriguez said. "They made assumptions about someone they didn't know, and those assumptions were completely wrong. You were a hero when I first met you in Afghanistan, you were a hero when you were cleaning airplanes and trying to heal from your trauma, and you're a hero now as you prepare to help other veterans. The job title never mattered, who you are is what matters." As Captain Rodriguez walked away toward his gate, Sarah reflected on his words. She thought about all the assumptions people had made about her over the years, and all the assumptions she had made about herself. She had believed that giving up medicine made her a failure, that working as a cleaner made her less valuable, that her struggles with PTSD made her weak. But now she was beginning to understand that healing wasn't linear, that sometimes the path forward required taking what seemed like steps backward, and that finding meaning in life wasn't about avoiding struggle, it was about finding ways to transform struggle into something useful for others. 6 months later, Sarah was working full-time as a peer counselor at the VA hospital. Her office was small but comfortable, decorated with photos of some of the veterans she had helped and certificates from the various training programs she had completed. She loved her new job in ways she hadn't expected. Each veteran she worked with brought unique challenges and strengths, and Sarah found that her own experiences with trauma and recovery gave her insights that traditional counselors sometimes missed. She could recognize the signs of PTSD because she had lived with them herself. She could offer hope for recovery because she had experienced it firsthand. One afternoon, Sarah was working with a young veteran named Tommy who had been struggling with anxiety and depression since returning from his deployment in Syria. Tommy had been a combat engineer, and he was having difficulty adjusting to civilian life after spending months defusing bombs and clearing roads. "I just feel like nobody understands what it was like over there," Tommy said during one of their sessions. "People here worry about such trivial things, and I can't relate to any of it. I feel like I don't fit anywhere." Sarah nodded, recognizing the feelings Tommy was describing. "Can I tell you something about my own experience?" she asked. Over the next few minutes, Sarah shared some of her own story with Tommy. She told him about her time as a combat medic, about the struggles she had faced after her discharge, and about the years she had spent working at the airport while she tried to figure out how to rebuild her life.
You worked as a janitor? Tommy asked, surprised. But, you're a counselor now. You have a college degree and all this training. The job title didn't matter, Sarah explained. What mattered was that I was taking care of myself and giving myself time to heal. There's no shame in doing whatever work you need to do while you figure out your next steps. Tommy was quiet for a moment, processing this information. So you think things can get better for me too? Sarah smiled. I don't just think it, I know it. Recovery looks different for everyone, and it takes time. But you have strengths and experiences that can become sources of meaning and purpose once you've had time to heal. As Tommy left that day, Sarah felt the familiar sense of satisfaction that came from knowing her work was making a difference. It was the same feeling she had experienced as a combat medic, but without the trauma and life-or-death pressure that had eventually become overwhelming. That evening, as Sarah drove home from work, she found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this point. 3 years ago, she had been hiding from her past, convinced that her struggles with PTSD meant she could never again do meaningful work. Now she was using those same struggles to help other people find their own paths to recovery and purpose. She thought about Captain Rodriguez, who had refused to let her disappear into anonymity and had forced her to confront the person she used to be. She thought about Dr. Vasquez, who had helped her see that trauma and healing could coexist, that it was possible to acknowledge pain without being defined by it. She thought about all the veterans she had worked with, each of whom had taught her something new about resilience and recovery. Most of all, she thought about the 17 soldiers she had been unable to save, whose deaths had haunted her dreams for years. They were still with her, but now they felt less like accusations and more like reminders of why her work mattered. Each veteran she helped was, in some small way, a tribute to those who hadn't made it home. As Sarah pulled into her driveway, she noticed that her neighbor was working in his garden. Mr. Peterson was an elderly man who had always been kind to her, though they had never talked about much beyond pleasantries about the weather. "Good evening, Sarah," he called out as she got out of her car. "How was work today?" "It was good," Sarah replied, and realized that she meant it. "Really good. What kind of work do you do?" Mr. Peterson asked. "I don't think you've ever mentioned it." For a moment, Sarah felt the old instinct to give a vague answer, to avoid revealing too much about herself. But then, she thought about everything she had learned over the past months about the importance of owning her story instead of hiding from it. "I'm a counselor at the VA hospital," she said. "I work with veterans who are transitioning back to civilian life." Mr. Peterson's face lit up with interest and respect. "That sounds like incredibly important work." "It is," Sarah said, and she felt a surge of pride in saying it. "It really is." As she walked to her front door, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that morning 3 years ago when she had first started cleaning airplanes. She was still the same person who had served as a combat medic in Afghanistan, but she had learned to see that service as a source of strength rather than shame. She was still someone who had struggled with PTSD and trauma, but she had learned to view that struggle as part of her journey rather than as a permanent limitation. Most importantly, she had learned that hiding from her past had been a necessary part of her healing process, but it hadn't been a permanent solution. True recovery had required facing her history, integrating her experiences, and finding ways to use both her strengths and her struggles to serve others. As Sarah settled in for the evening, she felt grateful for all the people who had seen her potential when she couldn't see it herself, who had refused to let her waste her talents, and who had helped her understand that heroes aren't people who never fall down, they're people who get back up and find ways to help others do the same. The next morning, Sarah would go back to work at the VA hospital, where she would continue helping veterans find their own paths from struggle to purpose, from isolation to community, from hiding to healing. And she would do so knowing that every person she helped was both a tribute to who she used to be and a step toward who she was still becoming.